You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
We're excited to talk about the University of Aberdeen and their online courses. It is the oldest university in Scotland, founded in 1495, and yet you can take their classes from the comfort of your own home and have 24/7 access to the learning material, no student visa required. Learn about the heritage of Scotland, the plagues, the witch trials, the history of the Second World War, the rise of political extremism, Jacobitism. Explore how Scotland's unique history, its culture, and tradition have shaped global movements. And learn about the men, women, and children who have left Scotland's shores in a special online course, The Scottish Diaspora, led by award-winning tutor Marjorie Harper. Ready to transform your passion for history into a recognized qualification? Check out the University of Aberdeen online at on.abdn.ac.uk and search history. That's on.abdn.ac.uk and search history. Or click on the link in our show notes. In my mind's eye, I see it. Hundreds of United States Army soldiers in the mountain passes, dressed in Army blue, shoulder to shoulder with the New Mexican militia, 2 years ago aligned with a different country, looking out into the distance. They know what's coming, a large force. It could be 3 times their size. At least twice. Texas militia, cavalry, probably artillery, led by the state's governor, Peter Bell, absolutely committed to seizing Santa Fe, the capital of this previously Mexican territory, today part of the present-day state of New Mexico, which the state of Texas in 1850 claims. From the Texas point of view, it's simple. They won this land from Santa Anna, and Peter Bell himself is a veteran who fought with Sam Houston at San Jacinto. But the men in the mountains see it differently. Texas can claim anything they want. It was never part of Spanish Texas. It was never part of Mexican Texas. They only surrendered to U.S. forces during the Mexican War on the promise that they would be able to form a state and join the United States. They do not permit slavery in this area. Some of them actually had helped to defeat the Texas expedition sent here when Texas was a republic and tried to seize the area from Mexican control. The Mexicans grew tired of Texas sending judges, sending representatives, trying to organize, saying that Santa Fe was a county. A local newspaper in Santa Fe says, if the Texans come again with their commissioners, tell them to send bodyguards. And then, something that the Texas considered absolutely audacious, New Mexico held a state convention and asked for a state. Outrage, mass meetings in Austin and other cities in Texas. Mississippi tells the governor of Texas he'll send military help. Congress can't solve the problem because it is deadlock, because this issue is directly connected to slavery. So it's not hard for, in my mind's eye, to develop this piece of fiction, which will have to be because of events that happen. It really is the logical extension of what every major player in this story of Zachary Taylor in the White House said they would do. And if you follow it to the logical extension, this is exactly what happens. A showdown in New Mexico. And one more thing. As U.S. soldiers are holding out, they receive word. Hold your line. The President of the United States is coming. Zachary Taylor himself will lead forces into battle.
He said he would lead the army, and he would crush them, he said.
It's not a crazy idea. It really isn't. In fact, it's exactly what Zachary Taylor tells a lieutenant that he's sending to the New Mexico territory to reinforce this budding territory, that if you do not have sufficient arms, I will bring reinforcements, and if necessary, I will lead them myself. He's already overridden his Secretary of War on this matter, a Georgian who supports the Texan position. It's not so much that Taylor would be fighting for Mexico, but fighting for the United States. When the Senate asks him, and they do, ask him what instructions he has given the Army around New Mexico, because there are many questions about it, he says the land was acquired by the United States from Mexico, and since held by the United States, and in my opinion ought to remain until the question of boundary shall have been determined by competent authority. Lewis Cass, who ran against Zachary Taylor in the last election, charges Taylor with the first steps of a dictatorship, perhaps, a military dictatorship. We didn't get that event. We didn't get to see what happens. We were robbed. The nation was robbed by his untimely death, and we know that part of the story. So we didn't get this what if, a little civil war in the western mountains that might have stopped the big one. Maybe. There were some northern congressmen who said maybe a little expedient war might stop the trouble that was brewing. Perhaps, as some historians have speculated, Zachary Taylor would be following in the footsteps of Andrew Jackson, who stood up to the nullifiers of South Carolina in the 1830s. And those causing trouble would have the same humiliation when a popular, well-supported U.S. president called on citizens to do nothing to help the Texans pursuing their claims and started making an army to go west. Nor was this incidental, by the way, because while we were robbed of these hypothetical events of an actual fight, it's a little-known fact in history that Taylor's vice president continues this hard-line policy in New Mexico and does not allow the Texans to take any lands, organize any counties. In fact, has the same policy without the military threat, without the language. Fillmore has the same policy as Taylor and sends troops to New Mexico to reinforce that federal policy. The great story of the Compromise of 1850 is that with the nation in an uproar and ready for war, with no one showing any give, no one showing any compromise, everyone mad, a senator from a state between North and South, Kentucky, a great compromiser who had compromised before, rose up to speak for compromise, for union, for everyone to get some of what they wanted, but not all. In his hand, as he spoke, he held a piece of wood from Washington's coffin. Union. No South. No North. Only Union. And before he made that trembling speech, he had knocked on the door of another senator, political rival, on a rainy night. Old Daniel Webster. The two could be running for president against each other in the next election for all they knew. He knocks on his door and they talk, and they agree to both speak not for the regions that they live, but for the Union. And they did, and forged a compromise that kept the nation from resorting to arms or violence or separation. And after each passed, there would be no more compromisers in this land, and the nation went to war. This story is dramatic. You'd like it to be true so much that it's been told this way for years. It's probably the standard fodder of textbooks and the like, of teachers' speeches. And a lot of these events did happen. That's what makes it compelling. I mean, they really did happen. Clay really did rise and speak. He really did knock on Webster's rain-soaked door. And it really was an important speech and an important proposal in history. And there was, at the end, a compromise forged But there's a lot of detail and nuance missing. For instance, Clay was too sick to ever finish that work that he began with that speech. And he only faced defeat when he personally led these efforts. But more importantly, there was a president in the White House at the time. Clay was a senator, happened to be of the same party as that president in the White House, Zachary Taylor. This is the part of the story that's not focused on enough. Zachary Taylor had put forward a proposal, as the Constitution says the president should do, suggest matters for Congress's consideration. He did. Clay's proposal was not the only answer in a leaderless time. It was a rival proposal for somebody that started to make it pretty clear he was contesting leadership of the Whig Party. It was one of many possibilities. And it succeeded only in a form and only after a tragedy. So that's the story that we shall tell in this episode. But to go back, we talked about Taylor's message of late 1849. Taylor's position was pretty clear, that it was more than posture. He took actions. California was to be admitted as a state in whatever form it wanted. Not what we want, not what Congress wants, what California wants. And that most certainly was to be a state that banned slavery. Taylor had sent a representative to California to test that issue and to deliver information back to him and make his opinions known. His representative reported back that there was almost no need for him to be here. The group in Sacramento wanted a state, and it would be a free state. Nonetheless, the president made it clear he'd support that measure. By September 1849, California did. This was not the bumbling of a dunce. It was a deliberate action that a president took to force the issue.
He was a Louisiana slaveholder. No one knew what his political views were really. He had not been active in politics. He didn't appear to be, how to put it, overly literate.
I talked to Sidney Blumenthal in 2017, and his books about Lincoln, there's a series of 4, are great. And it was part of that conversation that inspired me to do this series on Zachary Taylor, because so little had been done on him.
People in politics did not know him well, except that they thought he could get elected. And then he surprised everybody by declaring that he was against all the territories that had been taken in the Mexican War becoming slave territories and then slave states. He was opposed to the extension of slavery. The South revolted. The southern wing of the Whig Party and its leaders revolted. And there seemed as if there was going to be a civil war under Zachary Taylor.
Opponents noted they didn't consider Zachary Taylor some nullity in office. They considered him dangerous. And these actions, they considered a small group of opponents perhaps impeachable. Here's Albert Smith. Texas always does things in a big way. The definition of its territory included 2/3 of present-day New Mexico. Here's a key point. Mexican generals say they would have fought to the death, but they surrendered without a shot. One of the reasons they did is that the United States promised it would maintain the integrity of New Mexico, and that it would become a territory and then a U.S. state. Taylor was absolutely determined to enforce the promise that the U.S. government had made. He knew the Compromise of 1850 proposed would pass with New Mexico's resolution as a sop to Southerners. Taylor would not stand for this. Indeed, Taylor not only sent a representative to California, but he also sent a personal representative to the New Mexico territory, an extension of himself, because modern communications wouldn't effectively allow him to be there in this new territory. He furthermore gave instructions to his Secretary of War to tell the Army to hold their position and to not allow the state of Texas to organize the area or to allow New Mexican residents to engage seriously with Texas. This was the time that Texas had established Santa Fe County, now part of present-day New Mexico, and had 2 commissioners attempting to organize. As we quoted in the first episode, Sidney Blumenthal, who said, They misjudged Taylor completely. Taylor was not a hollow man without principles. Instead, he was a president with a national perspective. Once they became states, there could be no arguments because states' rights was a holy writ for the southern states. The argument was always whether they could have slavery as territories, because territories belong to all the nation, to all the states. Taylor instructed his envoy to California, a slaveholding Georgian, don't take sides on this slavery issue. But again, those instructions weren't necessary. The miners, principally from the north, the large population centers of the north, had no interest in competing with people who were going to arrive with enslaved workers to mine more gold than they could. No interest in that. All discussions in the early California Republic involved slavery being banned. Even a few slave owners who arrived in Sacramento saw the writing on the wall and supported the proposal as it was. Zachary Taylor did not comment on another development, the desire of Utah to become a territory, perhaps a state as well, Deseret, which admitted in 1850 would probably also be a free state. Taylor's plan had checked all the boxes for a solution, but later historians have written it out of history. Some have marked it, it was dead on arrival on the scene. Was it? Was it any more dead than Henry Clay's proposal? A few Southern historical journals, which would be the dominant viewpoint for years, said no one supported his plan. That's simply not true. That no one supported his plan would be news to John Bell of Tennessee, later a candidate for president in 1860. It would be news to Hannibal Hamlin, senator from Maine and a candidate for vice president in 1860. It would be news to those two stars of a future election. It would be news to Jacob Miller, the senator from New Jersey, who had broke with normally his Whig friend Henry Clay to support President Taylor's plan, which again is to admit California with no stipulations and no discussions of additional issues. It would be news to John Hale of New Hampshire, the Free Soiler, who supported the president's plan. It would be news to Truman Smith of Connecticut, who supported the president's and argued on the floor for its passage. As Senator Miller said, there should be no questions added. But in addition to these arguments and these powerful supporters on the Senate floor, they knew something else. None of the other proposals had enough votes, and Taylor's proposal was in effect backed with his veto. Here's Sidney Blumenthal. He was in a commanding position, Zachary Taylor was. On all sides, his opponents were exposed. Davis's proposal to just extend the Missouri Compromise didn't have the vote. In other words, to say the northern half, so you can have like Northern California, and we can go out through New Mexico to Southern California with slave states. Didn't have the vote. Wilmot's proposal, which is to say any state from the Mexican War would be free states, didn't have the votes. Zachary's plan had an advantage. It had no philosophy behind it. It was merely the work of perhaps someone who had been in national military service. It's just representing the reality of the ground that he knows well from his intelligence reports and his envoys. California is going to come in as a free state. Probably so is New Mexico. Why get into further debate? Taylor ridiculed Clay's proposal to blend a whole group of issues to make the South happy, in a sense, about California coming in, to add sugar to the proposal of California. He ridicules it as the omnibus, a reference to a group kind of early mass transit system that would be in D.C. through its muddy-caked streets. This omnibus that one could get on or get off of, that offered a little bit of a ride to each person, but not a complete solution, perhaps, to the problem for any one. Here's David Potter. The president's plan was simple, but not one Southern political leader could imagine a Louisiana slaveholder and a father-in-law of Jefferson Davis would take this side. Though anyone who knew him more knew that he and Davis disagreed often. Davis was a Democrat, he a Whig. Davis didn't support him in the 1848 election. He had said it in Pennsylvania, as we went over in the last episode. The people of the North need to have no apprehension of the further expansion of slavery. What does that mean? Making it pretty clear. His Pennsylvania trip has been lost to history, but he made a clear statement. He never backed off from it. He privately, according to many around him, saw himself as running for re-election in 1852 to get a new, stronger mandate. He never said no, let's put it that way. To Jefferson Davis, he said, the people would decide that later. Not a no, though. Not a I'm going to be a one-termer. He started seeing New York Senator William Seward more, backed by the powerful Thurlow Weed, editor and political boss of Whig politics in New York, the largest state in the nation, the one that could turn an election. He made him an unofficial presence at cabinet meetings and had him over. Zachary Taylor didn't like the speech that William Seward would make, his own plan, a very unworkable one. We'll talk about that later. He'd need Northern Whigs, though, to win in 1852. He'd need to reduce the size of the third party, the Free Soilers that existed in 1848. He'd have to convince them what Abraham Lincoln convinced people in Massachusetts during that 1848 election. What Abraham Lincoln tried to convince people. The Free Soil Party is the Whig Party. We are the ones against expansion of slavery and always have been. When his Whig supporter from Georgia, Robert Toombs, who had backed him in 1848, really enabled his nomination at the Philadelphia Convention, when he asked him, Mr. President, if they passed the Wilmot Proviso, if Congress was to pass a law that said no land ceded from Mexico could be slave states at all, he said, according to Toombs, if they see fit to pass it, I will not veto. It's according to Toombs, so we don't know everything about it, but it stopped Toombs from supporting Taylor anymore from that point. Previously, in 1849, been angry at people like Calhoun who were fire eaters, who were looking for disunion, and said, no, this man is Louisiana slaveholder. He's going to hold this union together. He's going to protect us. He's going to protect everybody. We're going to have a fair solution. And now you have the possibility that he might not veto this Wilmot Proviso. It's not really what Taylor said, that he's necessarily for Wilmot Proviso, but if Congress saw fit to pass it, he would, in a very Whiggish, careful way, not veto. There is very little chance that Congress would pass that Wilmot Proviso in its current form. But for Toombs, it was enough to say to others that Taylor had sold himself body and soul to the North. He would seethe. Here's Albert Smith. Taylor's objective was to prevent a civil war in 1850. His approach to the South was, you can't get New Mexico. You can't get California. So why stir up the North about it? Why do you incur all of this enmity against yourself? Settle for what you've got. As to the compromise, Albert Smith says, it's very dramatic and it makes a good story, namely that Taylor opposed the compromise of 1850 that Clay was putting forth, because he was jealous, perhaps, of Henry Clay. Taylor did not oppose that compromise. As separate bills, Taylor was for many of the provisions, and he never got a chance to veto anything. But when they combined into one bill, that omnibus program, that's what he opposed, mostly because it wouldn't pass. A common frame of reference is to say that Clay's compromise allowed California to enter the Union with statehood, but most Southerners at the time admitted this was a fait accompli. It was just a matter of what the South would get. Do we get something out of this, of creating this new free state that's going to change the balance of free states from 1515 to 16 free, 15 slave? Just a matter of what the South gets for it. And you get extreme views like Calhoun, who says, we want two presidents. We want a South president and a North president. And others who might be satisfied for a few things. But while I do want to represent the situation a bit from the typical history and remind everyone that through the tumultuous year of 1850, Taylor's plan is on the table. In fact, it's the default action that others have to come up with alternatives to. California was not accepting slavery, would not accept it. The debate in Congress was really, shall we award the South something? Is it necessary to give something to make this region happy? Here's David Porter, historian writing in the 1970s, whose book is well respected in terms of describing this area. He describes, by the way, the Compromise of 1850 not as a compromise at all, but as an armistice. Here's from Edwin P. Hoyt. In the 1850, the United States consisted of 30 states, 15 slave, 15 free. The population was growing much more rapidly in the North than the South. The members of the House from the North would outnumber the Southerners. In the Senate, the South always had protection, but that equality of states was what guaranteed it. So Southern Whigs were determined to resist the admission of California until some other issues would be settled. Hoyt joins many historians in writing that Clay's compromise offered more provisions favorable to the South, but underneath sealed defeat of the fate of slavery. This is because California's admission would put the weights of free and slave out of balance. What only a few historians acknowledge is that this didn't actually happen, by the way. You had a Southerner from Mississippi who becomes one of the Californian senators, and he votes with the South up until 1859. At one point, they have 2 pro-Southern senators in the new state of California. So the fact that it was free itself did not mean that its senators were voting that way in Congress. In 4 years, Douglas is going to get Kansas, Nebraska, and open up all the territories to strife and possible slave state status. So 1850 is an armistice, not a compromise. It does not settle the issue. It does not settle the issues of the territories at all.
AI is incredible. It can teach you how to fry an egg and even write a poem, pirate style. Yarr! But it knows nothing about your work. Slackbot is different. It doesn't just know the facts. It knows your schedule. It can turn a brainstorm into a brief. And it doesn't need to be taught. Because Slackbot isn't just another AI. It's AI that knows your work as well as you do. Visit slack.com/meet Slackbot to learn more.
New Year, same extra value meals at McDonald's. So now get 2 snack wraps, plus fries, and a medium soft drink for just $8.
For limited time only. Prices and participation may vary. Prices may be higher in Hawaii, Alaska, and California, and for delivery.
Here's Hoyt again. The president took serious issue with Henry Clay and his attempts at compromise. He told Congressman Horace Mann that the Union could and would be maintained without the shedding of a drop of blood, because if the South did secede, he would send a fleet to blockade its cotton. Exactly what happened 10 years later. We haven't talked too much about Thomas Hart Benton, but he is a force in this Senate. And it's interesting because he is a Democrat. He's a supporter of Jackson, opposite side of politics from Zachary Taylor. But here, when this also a military general comes to be president, we find Benton first trying to work with Clay on some type of compromise and then shifting over to President Taylor's side. California had no connection to Wilmot, and it has nothing to do with fugitive slave laws and should be admitted separately. Congress hasn't touched the institution of slavery in 60 years. Taylor tells Horace Mann, "I have taken an oath to support the Union, and I will not commit perjury." He repeats the same speech in Fredericksburg, June, May 1850. The speech is very popular, and there's much positive comment in Virginia. California would ruin the long-standing equilibrium, free states would outnumber slave states. The South also was declining in population. The North and the West was growing. And there was not a clear slave state at all in any of these new territories that they could see. Talk of expanding the Texas border, pursuing that claim in order to have a larger area where slavery was permitted. Talk of a Southern California that perhaps could have slavery. We're about as close as they came. And they weren't as close to real things that could happen. So it's possible to see Taylor's position as Toombs did, a mere cave to the north. Or perhaps he's just Blythe, this non-politician ignoring all the problems and just saying, admit California, playing the fiddle while Rome burns in a sense in Congress. But again, I go back to Taylor's plan is the default plan. It has supporters in Congress, continues to have support in Congress. Clay makes his first proposals in January and then a second speech in May, which he takes on Taylor a little bit more strongly. He talks about 5 gaping wounds that have affected the nation and must be cured in order to proceed with the Union and could keep the Union together. The president's plan could have hung there as an alternative when the other unpopular plans went nowhere, as they were seeming to do, and when American public opinion pushed for action, and when the Californians arrived. Absent statehood organization, could the U.S. guarantee that California wouldn't seek out its own independence, seek out a foreign power? A lot of pressure on the California situation, given how far away it was. Are you to deny them? Most in Congress want California as a state, enough to make it happen. It would be free. As one Southern senator said, it was merely a question of how much humiliation our region would have to suffer for it. Clay's compromise is an alternative to reduce that humiliation, a different strategy. And Clay has more opponents than just Taylor. He's also opposed by the fire eaters, by disunionists, by Calhoun. And Calhoun's too sick in 1850 to present his speech. But on March 4th, he is wheeled in, sort of, from his sickbed, and James Mason of Virginia reads Calhoun's speech that he would have made. And Calhoun spins it that he's a unionist. This union is great. It's complex. It's a cultural, spiritual, religious elements. Those who say it can be broken in a single blow are not right. It's not right. Again, Calhoun's presenting it as he's the greatest unionist of all. He understands the union better than everybody. He's got these bone and sinew connections between all of us. But what the whole anti-slavery business has done, of you people in the North, is reduce it so that all you have left, you're really reducing those cultural cords. You're shaming us. You're really reducing everything. You're splitting up our churches. The only cord left is force. Legal force, perhaps military force. Your choice is to provide some sort of equilibrium here, some sort of mechanism. He wanted something like, he doesn't specify in this speech, but he's named a bunch of proposals in the past. I mean, the biggest one would be to guarantee the rights that if Calhoun or someone from South Carolina had an enslaved person, they could bring it to the Minnesota Territory, they could bring it to California, anywhere, and that person's still a slave, something that was very much in doubt with all of these proposals. Almost to answer Webster of Massachusetts, his fame established. He had been courted among supporters of the Wilmot Proviso and had not spoken out for it. He's in a little trouble in home in Massachusetts for this reason. But he speaks in this moment, and Calhoun watches him. Daniel Webster, this great New Englander, said that the South had legitimate grievances. He also made the point that in the West, there can be no slavery. Cotton won't grow there. And I know this is an argument that you see made many times. And I am more with Jefferson Davis on this argument, and he turned out to be right. That yes, you could have slavery in the West. So Webster's position on this, and Clay would make this point too, that we're arguing over nothing. You can't grow cotton in the West. Well, it wouldn't take that long for better irrigation systems to expand where you could grow cotton. But Davis, for instance, talked about Southern California as an area that he was anxious to bring slaves to, that perhaps Mississippi could unload some of their slave capital, as he would have seen it, to Southern California. Webster argues we're arguing over nothing here. Cotton won't grow there. He makes a very moving, long speech that has entered the history books for Union, and then he sits down, becoming a pariah in his region in the North. Here's from Blumenthal. Praised in the South, Webster was damned in the North. Mr. Webster spoke yesterday, and can you believe it? He is a fallen star, wrote Horace Mann, Lucifer descending from heaven. We all had the greatest confidence in him. He disappointed us all. William Seward takes the Senate floor on March 11th. He's the first Northerner to speak out about the compromise. It's his maiden speech on the Senate. But he's not considered a freshman talking out of turn. Instead, he's considered the former governor of New York and a confidential advisor to the president. He's rebuking Clay and he's rebuking Webster. He announced, for the admission of California and New Mexico and any future states unconditionally. But it is insisted that the admission of California shall be attended by a compromise of questions which have arisen out of a slavery. I am opposed to any such compromise. His presence, Blumenthal writes, was bird-like, his voice not melodious, and his address larded with lengthy classical quotations. Seward said, the right to have a slave implies the right in someone to make the slave. That right must be equal and mutual, and this would resolve society into a state of perpetual war. Seward is going to be lambasted by everybody. Historians, really since then, by his own political boss and manager, Thurlow Weed, in New York, thinking he wasted an opportunity, by the president, both in private comments Zachary Taylor makes and through his newspaper, The Republic, for taking an opportunity to attack Clay's addition of these elements to the admission of California and turning it into some moral crusade about slavery on the floor. But again, here we forget. Seward was right. He might have been righteous, but he was also right. And he says that compromise is radically wrong and essentially vicious. All biographies of Zachary Taylor see Seward's speech as a missed opportunity. Here was an opportunity for this powerful New York senator, the Whig defender of the president's plan, to embrace it and speak about it. Instead, saying that there was a higher law than the Constitution that we had to subscribe to. This didn't go over well in any of the press. Here is Sean Willentz. By the early morning of the 31st, John Calhoun was dead. The Capitol was draped in black. At noon on April 2nd, the desks removed from the old Senate chamber, and the pallbearers, including Clay Webster and Lewis Cass, carried Calhoun's metal coffin to the center of the room. On the podium sat the president, the vice president, and the speaker, while the members of the Senate and the House, Cabinet, and Supreme Court surrounded him to hear Calhoun eulogized by the Senate chaplain. But when Daniel Webster beckons Thomas Hart Benton, the Democratic senator, to join the chorus of mourners, he refuses. He is not dead, sir. He is not dead. There may be no vitality in his body, but there is in his doctrines. Benton was not one to mince words. Calhoun died with treason in his heart and on his lips. A committee of 13 was assigned to consider all these plans, and the omnibus takes shape. California would be, as David Porter describes, a tow rope to pull other things that congressmen didn't want to vote for. Porter also adds, until May, Clay had kept up a flimsy pretense that his proposals were in accord with the spirit of Taylor's program. And on May 21st, he openly challenged Taylor. The Washington Republic, which would have been Zachary Taylor's favorite paper, declared a national misfortune that Clay disturbed the unity. He's appropriating the spotlight for a third compromise, for his own fame. Yet as debate over Clay's bill continued into the summer, its chances for passage dwindled. Clay's prickly demeanor and his obvious distaste for the Taylor White House didn't help his cause. The major problems were arithmetic. With all of his prestige, Clay could muster only about 1/3 of the members of each house to support the measure, now mocked by President Taylor as the omnibus. Taylor and most Northern Whigs stuck to the president's original plan, admitting the states only. Whigs and Democrats from the Deep South would not agree to any bill that admitted California as a free state. Even if by some parliamentary miracle Clay were to find the necessary votes, it was no longer clear that the incensed Taylor would abide by his campaign promise not to exercise his veto power. Okay, so, Lentz, I think, accurate summary of what's going on here, that Taylor has the goods, and probably the more likely thing is not that Clay's compromise is going to be worked out. If you have this amazing compromise, and you're holding Washington's coffin in your hand when you make the speech, it probably should take pretty quickly, and it didn't. Washington City, before the Civil War, offered various amusements, according to the book Empire of Mud, which is a book about the history of D.C. Racetracks, they said, were just ubiquitous on every corner on the outskirts of Washington City, where people would head out to these tracks that were bordered by cornfields or apple orchards and bet on horses. According to the description of one man of the cloth, not only was he there, but every businessman was in town. It wouldn't be uncommon to see a president of the United States there, people of various races there, all betting on horses, and about a third of the crowd were female. From the lowest beggar to the president of the United States, everyone was there. For senators that were not at the races, games of whist might be played. It's a card game with a twist. You have two teams of two, and your co-player sits across from you. It's kind of like a Uno type in its play. You match suits, clubs and spades, etc. You keep adding to the cards if you have the same suit, unless you have the trump card that can change the suit. But generally it would be played in drives, so there would be whist drives with lots of tables playing the cards at once. Another board-based card game called Faro was very similar. It's kind of close to a baccarat, involving 13 cards laid out, involving a banker, and you play against multiple people can play against the banker. Pennsylvania Avenue, it was said, was lined up with faro banks. You'd play cards and they'd also make supper. People would play hazard, which is a dice game. You'd be throwing like buckets of dice, boxes of dice against a table. Brag, which is a game not unlike poker. I read about this description of a huge panoramic painting in Washington, D.C. in 1850. The canvas provided the moving pictures before the invention of the camera. Is a very popular thing to go to see a panoramic picture. For 50 cents, you could be let in and just see this huge painting and walk around it. In 1850, a painter, Henry Lewis, brought his mile-long scroll. Think about that, a mile-long painting. And he brings it to Washington, D.C. It's among the largest paintings in America or Europe at the time. And it is of a view of the Mississippi. So it's as if a boat is just going down the Mississippi and what you see for a mile. President Zachary Taylor comes to see this painting. And the President of the United States is shocked to see his own home, Cypress Grove. It really is Zachary Taylor's plantation. But he sees that plantation, Cypress Grove, in this painting. It would be the last time he, quote, saw his house. Seward writes to Weed on June 20th, Mr. Clay's omnibus bill lingers and drags. He is looking very haggard. He betrays impatience and temper. And so you have many debating points. There's a Klingman, he was a moderate, now he's a fire eater, who says, Northerners have gone too far. He mentions the South furnished 2/3 of the troops for the Mexican War. This is going to be a point you hear a lot at this time. With Minnesota, with Utah, New Mexico, and California, and Oregon, the South will be as powerless as a shorn Samson. Do not cheat us. Don't give us nothing. Senator Howard of Texas calls out Taylor for encouraging California to coercing it to form a state. Jacob Miller of New Jersey says, no one who knows the president, no one who knows this patron in the White House would believe he'd resort to a trick. All the president wants. The South always says, leave us alone. The president is trying to do that. As thoroughly devoted to the Union as any man in Washington, the president considered Clay and Douglas's concessions a mere patchwork, a salve on a cancer. He retained the allegiance of every Northern Whig senator, with 2 exceptions, and also won over some Northern Democrats, who formerly leaned the other way. Even Cass, Lewis Cass, Taylor's 1848 opponent, deemed the compromise that Clay had, the omnibus, incapable of passage. And he noted that Walker and Felch, 2 Democrats, were switching to the administration. Never before had Taylor been so powerful, where anti-extensionism was concerned, as at the outset of July. I want to flash forward now to July 31st, 1850. And, spoiler alert, a tragic event has happened. A great general, a popular president, is no longer with us. Vice President Millard Fillmore, who had been present in the Senate as its president through these debates, had made it clear that he favored some type of compromise, was now in the White House. Henry Clay can delay no longer. The omnibus bill comes up. And it's picked apart by amendments. Just as the deceased President Taylor had suggested, omnibus, something for all. Get in, ride, get your part of what you want, and join in voting for it would not work. Each part is hated by enough people to vote it down. So all of its parts, the Texas boundary settlement, the New Mexico territorial government, voted down. In fact, the admission of California is even voted down. All that is approved is the Utah Territorial Organization. Odd bedfellows celebrate the defeat of Henry Clay's compromise on the 31st. Jefferson Davis loves that this compromise was defeated, but so does William Seward. So does William Dayton of New Jersey. So does Benton, bitterly opposed to Calhoun. He loves it.
Yeah, the Compromise of 1850 is highly mythologized into this iconic view of, especially of the Senate, as though it were a classical Roman ideal forum. And these great titans like, Clay and Webster and Calhoun, all playing their different roles, but men of principles who deliver these deathless orations, and then the country is somehow saved because they believe in the Union. This is not what happened. Just not what happened, and not who these people are, and not how people responded to it. Clay attempted to relive his past, and they all wanted to be president. When you're dealing with Clay, Webster, and Calhoun, you're dealing with people of curdled ambition who had all wanted to be president and failed to be president.
Well, so much has changed in the Senate.
Yeah, that's right. Clay tried to patch together a grand compromise like he had in the Missouri Compromise, and it fell apart. It completely collapsed. He was enfeebled physically. He could barely climb the stairs of the Capitol. And this legislative genius, it just lost the touch. And it all shattered in his hands.
Clay is, as a biographer says, as melancholy as Caius Marius over the ruins of Carthage. 2 days later, he goes to Newport to recuperate and does not come back to D.C. during the debate. So I know that we're going to find out later that Stephen Douglas, the true author of the 1850 Compromise, will pick up these pieces and get it done with a friendly president who's now not going to veto it. My point is that Clay's Compromise is seen as popular. It's seen as the way to go. It's the way the textbook is written. It's not. It's proposed in some form in March, and it developed in May, and it goes to July 31st unpassed. Here's Sean Willentz. While the speech has captivated the reading public, more mundane political efforts proceeded inside the Capitol's committee rooms. A special Senate committee, chaired by Henry Clay, offered a long bill that incorporated several elements of Clay's proposed compromise. Admission of California as a free state, the organization of 2 new territories, New Mexico and Utah, which had applied for admission in March, without reference to slavery, and a $10 million compensation to Texas in exchange for Texas's recognition of New Mexico's boundary claims. The committee's bill helped to dampen the radical disunionist fervor in the South, where the Nashville Convention, boycotted by Louisiana and North Carolina as well as most of the border South states, transpired in June with only minor incident. Amidst all of this tumult, the people of New Mexico, protected, as we said, by federal troops, submit a statehood petition. The first line in it says that all men are equal in this new state. No slavery. Texas has asked them to vote for county commissioners. Not a single man in the New Mexico Territory showed up to vote in the election. There was a boycott. Taylor supports the statehood petition, issues a special message to the Senate indicating that Texas is interfering and should not. Alexander Stevens writes in the National Intelligencer, the first federal guns that are fired at Texas will rally all from Delaware to the Rio Grande. The New York Journal of Commerce says the president is right in his course. The Hartford Courant says the actions of Texas will lead to disunion. The New York Express says if Texas invades New Mexico, the president will preserve things as they are. Greeley's Tribune says Taylor's course is the only right course here, and he hated Taylor. Cass, his 1848 opponent, tries to pass a bill banning soldiers from being used under civil authority. Even Sam Houston can't agree with that. With the serious impasse thoroughly recognized, with bellicose, with his state up in arms in southern camps training in Texas, the crisis was indeed a flaming one. Who in all the sweep of history, even in Carolina's rice plantations or in Charleston's sheltered gardens, could be more flamboyantly state-proud than Texans? Than Texas's rootin'-tootin' sons, irked at Taylor because of defects in federal Indian defenses. Leathery Texans felt he carried a chip on his shoulder due to old disciplinary problems with Texas soldiers. In an impassioned speech, Houston charged that Texans were traduced and defamed by the president executive during the Mexican War. Who could expect open-mindedness of this president when he had been unwarrantably hostile to them? Alan Hall wrote in rebuttal in the Republic newspaper. He quoted in detail the wartime letter forming the basis of the Houston allegations. Then he charged the Raven with monstrous perversion of the language and meaning of rough and ready. From Blumenthal, as the crisis over New Mexico careened towards the brink, Taylor's enemies harped on a scandal implicating members of his cabinet in order to cripple him. Taylor decided to shake up his cabinet. Quietly, he called Thurlow Weed to the White House. He should, he said, consult with no other person of such information as I possessed, of the character and qualifications of the men he might think for the cabinet. Taylor told him he had made an initial mistake in appointing a cabinet whose majority was from the South, and he would rectify it by creating one mostly drawn from the free states. He would replace all 3 members involved in the Gulfin scandal, Meredith, Crawford. He would also replace Secretary Preston and try to get Crittenden back on his cabinet, who he wanted on his cabinet originally, on the cabinet. Weed suggested Governor Hamilton Fish of New York, and Taylor decided this is a splendid idea. His plan remained a secret. He planned to make these announcements of these appointments July 6th or 7th. Now, we only have this from Weed, of course. You now have this crucial moment where Toombs and Stevens visit Taylor on July 3rd and demand that he change his policy on New Mexico. Stevens and Toombs believe that it's merely an issue of Taylor being talked into it, that he's hearing whispering from Seward and Weed, and this is why he's doing this whole thing. Taylor is enraged by Toombs and Stevens. Not only does he say he absolutely will not budge on New Mexico, but he thinks they're committing treason, and he says that he hung traitors in Mexico. General Taylor never intended to shoot anyone by simple order, but if he was tried and convicted of treason, if anyone was, Taylor would have no problem fulfilling that order. That's the point that a lieutenant in the Army makes. They should not expect any mercy from him. Southern Whigs, particularly Alexander Stephens of Georgia, Robert Toombs of the same state, Humphrey Marshall, Charles Conrad, all opposed to the Ultras, all opposed to Calhoun, had supported Zachary Taylor, all of them, and all would be future Confederates in military or in government. They call on Zachary Taylor as a kind of, is there some hope here? Can you yield your position on New Mexico a little? The answer is no. Crawford, his war secretary, says, if you sign an order for Colonel Monroe to resist Texas's expressing jurisdiction over the New Mexico area, I won't participate in it. I won't sign it. Taylor says, I'll sign it myself. Now, what is not known exactly is what he says to Stephen and Toombs when they visit him July 5th. The Philadelphia Bulletin newspaper says they barged in on Taylor and said, protect the South or we will vote censure of you in the Goffin affair or directly for intervention in New Mexico. Stevens denies that he ever said this. Toombs denies that he barged in on the president. Newspapers double down on this story. Throughout their lives, both of them would deny it happened. Toombs tells Naval Secretary Preston that if Taylor sends troops to New Mexico, he will be impeached by him.
He said he would lead the army. He was a general. He would lead the army, and he would crush them, he said. He said he would hang its leaders.
Wow.
He was known as rough and ready, and he was.
So here's how David Potter, whose account on things I like, here's how he writes in the 70s about it. In a last-ditch effort to arrest what they regarded as Taylor's mad course, the Southern Whigs sent a committee to remonstrate with him. But he remained adamant and made it clear that he intended to go ahead with his plans for admitting New Mexico as a state, with the disputed region at least provisionally included. He would use force, he indicated, to suppress any resistance that his action might provoke. It was in this matter, rather than his attitude towards the compromise as a whole, that Taylor most clearly demonstrated his indifference to the dangers of the situation. The overall territorial problem was not of his making, and his proposed solution won approval from some able contemporaries during the crisis and from some able historians long after. But he himself precipitated the New Mexico crisis by his hasty attempt to award a disputed area to a prospective new state before the long-standing and strongly black claims of an adjoining state had been settled. Events were soon to show that the risk Taylor took was unnecessary and that the kind of boundary settlement that he desired could be readily attained by the use of tact money and forbearance. But Taylor, refusing to see this possibility, persisted in a policy which, had continued to the end, might have well started a war. That is one point of view, David Potter, right? And it's not wrong to say that Taylor's actions could have led to a war. Or this popular president, because we're going to find out in a few days how popular this president was, backing this thing would have made it impossible for tempers not to be let down a bit and for some compromise to be worked out. Because as Potter says, all it took in a few months to get Texas, including its governor, to get the state to vote 2-1, and to get the Texas governor to sign was a compromise that gave the state $10 million. That's a lot of money in those times. I mean, it's billions of dollars. That's a huge subsidy, in effect, from the federal government to a relatively new state of Texas, which had been a Republican, had debt, that we will just simply pay. And the bondholders were so influential in Texas that you could turn that opinion around from wanting to go to war over this new territory to essentially giving up on it and accepting the boundary that you have today between Texas and New Mexico. Potter thinks that Taylor, by standing his ground, could have started a war. And that's the question that remains. And of course, as this debate rages in Congress, but let's say it's clear, some test votes and workouts, the Washington Monument is dedicated in the city. So as you're having this conflict, and he's just called some congressmen traitors, apparently, Hannibal Hamlin hears this, they're dedicating the Washington Monument. They're going to start working on it. It's actually going to take years for this monument to be finished. It's embroiled in a debate over immigration, conspiracy theory about stones from the Vatican and things like that. It's going to be 34 years before that monument that you see today is completed. So, what he spends the day dedicating, Chester Arthur will have to finish dedicating. That's how long it takes. It's hot. I just went to D.C. Recently, and I was in an air-conditioned place. And when I stepped out, it's just a very hot city. So this is July. The Washington Republic warned, drink no liquors. Do not heat yourselves. When heated, drink cold water in moderation. Eat no fresh meats, unless very good. And here's my favorite. Defer anxious thoughts to a cooler season. Do not forego repose. That's pretty good advice from the Washington Republic, Zachary Taylor's own newspaper. It doesn't appear that he followed it. This important occasion, of course, requires his presence. So for long speeches in the hot sun, although apparently he's sitting in the shade, he listens to Senator Henry Foote, who is arguing against Taylor's own plan and insisting that the South gets something for admitting California. But he's making this great speech about the Union here at the Washington Monument. He tells Foote, I like your speech, but I would like you to follow that advice more often. And after the speeches, he, a believer in walking as exercise, does his usual walk throughout the city. It appears he had no hat on during this walk. So think possible dehydration, think about sunburn. He gets back to the White House, he's hungry, he's thirsty, he's hot. He eats, depending on the accounts, either cucumbers, bread, mush, maybe cabbage. The majority of accounts say cherries. He also drank milk, and iced water in order to cool down. And he starts getting stomach cramps, which he sometimes did. Though capable of physical activity, he's a man that spent decades in insect-ridden frontiers, and he never really lost his appetite. Holt Hamilton suggests army life gave him the digestion of an ostrich, and he tempted fate. As of midnight, his sleep is restless, and he's still feeling these cramps. Unhelpfully to history, his doctor records cholera morbus. But that is not the cholera disease that you and I know. It rather is an outdated medical description of cramps, gastroenteritis, upset stomach. Symptoms of normal cholera were not present. There wasn't a wide epidemic, although there's some newspaper accounts that a few people were getting sick. Well, not like kind of a wide epidemic that actually get one in the start of Buchanan's administration several times in D.C., where it's like, don't drink the water. That doesn't appear to be what happened here. And he's able to function somewhat even in his sickbed and cover the office of president. One thing he does is sign a treaty with Great Britain. I did an episode recently on Theodore Roosevelt, his vice presidency. And that treaty with Great Britain, the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, is going to last for another 50 years. So the relatively friendly relationship with a few hiccups that the United States will have with Great Britain begins at Zachary Taylor's sickbed. Now, perhaps unfortunately, the doctor's visit. His key doctor is summoned from Baltimore on July 7th. He's given quinine. He's given calomel. Calomel sounds like a nice thing. It feels like a medicine. It's mercury chloride, and it's basically poisonous. And for 19th century doctors, and 18th century doctors as well, it's something of a wonder drug because it makes a patient purge. And for a lot of things, that's what you need to do. And here's where I think is key. Something that he hadn't had previously, which is a fever. He's vomiting. How much of this is the medicine? And how much of this is the existing condition that he had? We simply don't know. And really, this saga goes on for a week. There's a certain point in the Capitol where they hear that the president's better and there's 3 cheers, only to get sadder news. The family is in the other room in the White House grieving. In a timing that couldn't be worse, Congress, not fully aware of the situation, nearly votes to censure the president for his involvement in the Goffin matter. Tuesday, July 9th, there's again one of those rumors that he had rallied. And as we discussed in episode 1, Taylor's supporters defend him in the House and in the Senate. John Bell and Truman Smith argue for his plan over the Clay Compromise. When Webster is arguing, he's interrupted and makes the announcement. Taylor's doctor tells him, not long. Taylor tells him, I know it. You have done all you can. Storm and passing have swept away this trunk. I expect the summons soon. A stimulant is given, and it does nothing. His death is declared at 10 o'clock at night. A 2-mile procession is had in Washington with 100,000 spectators. Thomas Benton said, his death was a public calamity. No man could have been more devoted to the Union. His position as a Southern man would have given him a power in the settlement. Here's what the British ambassador said. Firmness, which his opponents called obstinacy, was his predominant characteristics. His intentions were good. His word could be relied upon, and he died almost universally respected. You know the part of the history now. The Compromise of 1850 in separate bills, one for the fugitive slave law, one to ban the slave trading in Washington, D.C., Not much there because right across the river in Alexandria, Virginia, is where the largest slave operation in the country is. California's admitted, and the New Mexico boundary is settled with Texas, more or less where the state lines are today. As it turned out, a $10 million payment. If you use economic weight relative to U.S. GDP, where the 1850 economy was only about $2 billion, $10 million in that time is such a significant chunk of the entire economy that it equates to roughly $150 billion today. That amount of money coming to the former republic, now state of Texas, and its debt holders is so influential that the state votes 2-1 to accept this deal, and the governor, who is going to take arms against New Mexico, signs it. Not much else is said there. There's also much less talked about, many side deals in this agreement.
And the whole thing collapses, and who steps in but Stephen A. Douglas, who's, in his 30s. He knows how to pass this bill. He cuts it up into pieces, and he attaches each piece of legislation to a financial interest, like the Texas bond lobby or the Illinois bond lobby. Illinois bonds have been bad since the Panic of 1837. Texas bonds depended upon Texas being fully admitted as a state, and so on. And he had a bigger agenda in the background, which was to build the Illinois Central Railroad from Chicago all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. He had gone into certain southern states, talked to the legislatures, and they were open to those special interests. And Douglas himself had bought the lakeshore land in Chicago, which he then sold as the right-of-way. And tied into this was Wall Street, State Street in Boston, enormous financial interests, the lobbyists in Washington, the banks, and that's why Douglas emerged as a national leader, and why the Compromise of 1850 passed, which was linked to the Illinois Central Railroad Act, the first great federally charted railroad.
Not talked about as much in those history books. And not what's wrong or right? History changes over time. It was very common for Congress people to be personally involved in certain things, much more than today. Well, yes, more than today. Most historians avoid the question of what Zachary Taylor would have done had he not died. I see in Hamilton's book that there's no reason to speculate. Who knows? The question is often framed, could Zachary Taylor have avoided a civil war? Could his actions in 1850 avoided a civil war? That's a difficult question. Indeed, he may have started one. So you're only really talking about, it's kind of like a bloodletting theory, like maybe, which is very appropriate to 19th century medical, right? Maybe letting out a little bit of blood, as some northern congressman said, quick little expedient war would stop the big one. Maybe the disunionists would be so embarrassed that no one would want to try it again. There is that possibility, particularly if you had a little fight in New Mexico, or even a stand down where Texas withdraws and there's some type of congressional settlement after that. Maybe you get a settlement that doesn't need to involve a fugitive slave law because the Southerners in Congress are in no position anymore, after having one of their own stand them down, or I should say stand the most extremist of them down, and anything associated with them is now humiliating compared to this popular president defending U.S. territory. If they're seen as bandits, if they're seen as reckless, perhaps the settlement looks very different. Doesn't need a fugitive, which is really the part that tore apart everything. Fugitive slave law. We know this. Zachary Taylor would not have backed down if New Mexico was threatened by an armed force. He had already ordered the reinforcement of it. So there already was going to be some ability to hold there. And then he was committed for more. As we had indicated earlier, and this is not a well-known fact in history, Millard Fillmore continues this position and will not allow Texas and New Mexico. The compromise isn't signed till September 30th. So there's still months after Zachary Taylor's death where this is not settled. Zachary Taylor's position there is clear. On the other hand, does a little standoff in the West really change the events of 1861? We know that, say, battles in Kansas in the West were treated like a separate thing, even though it got awfully violent, a little prelude to Civil War. And actually, if you have a battle in Civil War, to take the Southern historian's position a little, you just get Civil War earlier. You get a group of states ready, able, with the infrastructure to develop a large army of combined states militias to help out Texas. That might have been what happened. And maybe Taylor's forced to go with his blockade strategy he was going to do, and you have a kind of civil war. Maybe it doesn't go so well. So all of these things are possibilities. Here's what I think, if we're going to engage in this what if. It's more likely that if Zachary Taylor makes a bold stand, that he largely succeeds. I think more likely that there is a political solution that results as he makes his stand in New Mexico, avoiding, for the most part, maybe outside of a few scraps, a massive military conflict. And the event that I think would be key to history being different if Zachary Taylor leaves, if Zachary Taylor lives, is not the New Mexico situation and is not his signing or not signing of the Compromise of 1850. It's his reelection in 1852 and having a solid 8 years of a more Whig administration would have led to different policies. The Franklin Pierce administration and James Buchanan administrations are seen as some of the worst in the nation's history. So right there in 1852, by a re-elected Taylor, and there is indications that he was seeking that re-election, though he didn't directly say it. Jefferson Davis felt that he was toying with it. His campaign speech, no other way to call it, his campaigns to Pennsylvania and New York, key states, Virginia later, another key state having been won by the Democrats in 1848, winnable by a Zachary Taylor. He might have lost a few of the Deep South states. He would have gained Ohio and New York and been very formidable in that election year and probably would have consolidated the free soil vote. You now have no Nebraska, Kansas. It was signed by Pierce. It's not going to be signed by Taylor. You have no fugitive slave law further agitating north. And you have some kind of United States moving forward. Now, maybe, again, it's the United States that has slavery in it for longer than 1865, most likely. So we can sit back and say, wouldn't it be great to have avoided that Civil War? And, of course, all of those deaths, all of that tumult. But you also, it would have been a more managed, gradual, perhaps, ending of slavery. So it's kind of a be careful what you wish for in that way. Of course, we'll never know. I hate leaving things with we'll never know, but you have to with Zachary Taylor. He's a president who died in office, and I really, you have these conversations about Kennedy, and what would have happened, say, with Vietnam. So you got one there. Who knows about Henry Harrison? We know Garfield, and there's always such a lost promise with presidents who die in office. But as the My History Can Beat Up Your Politics guy, right, I also have to remind you of the politics. It would still be a president that, although personally popular, and I do think the New Mexico standoff, either way it's resolved, might have been the kind of public opinion boosting thing that would have changed his presidency in a lot of ways, favoring those senators who chose to be on his side, putting the Seward and Weed in a powerful position earlier. But there's also a lot of politics. It's still a very competitive, long-lasting Democratic Party. They called it the Democracy for a reason. Like, it has this kind of plural name. It's just the Democracy. It's a large party with a lot of parts. There's a lot of people working for it. There's a lot of money behind it, a lot of support behind it. It is the party of the little common man. That's really the way the democracy is seen in the 19th century. They don't all like Taylor. Taylor, through his actions, had, depending on the accounts you believe, they said in Georgia his name was like a bad word now. So he's going to have problems in the Deep South, South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia. Not his home state of Louisiana, not Kentucky, not the border states, but he's got politics to deal with and a very powerful party that wants him out of office and wants their people in. It's always going to be hard for Zachary Taylor as a Whig to get things passed. But I do believe that a Zachary Taylor reelected in 1852 is a much more positive result for the country than what resulted afterwards. Why even bother with what ifs, right? If you do, then there's not much point talking about Zachary Taylor. He's president for a year and 4 months. He did a few things. We could talk about that. There's not much point. And if you stay completely out of the what if, you have a president who made sure that California was not held hostage and put in the closet forever, let's say. He had a forceful advocacy for the admission of California. You had the relationship with Britain and a couple of other things. And then he died. I mean, that's all you have. So you have to go to the what ifs. Why bother? Because it helps you to understand. I think it's just a useful contrast for the history that did happen. That's all. I mean, you what did you lose from the presidencies of Buchanan and Pierce that did happen? From Kansas, Nebraska, from Civil War in Kansas, from Douglas's later fights with Buchanan and his own party over the interpretation of his Kansas, Nebraska, and the Civil War. All those things connected. What did you lose? What could you have had? I guess thinking about what could have been is not idle. It helps you to understand what was. I want to thank you for listening. My history can beat up your politics. If you want, on the Patreon, there's a lot more things to listen to. I can't say I have more Zachary Taylor because I'm kind of spent out on Zachary Taylor. We'll see if there's an extras. But there's a lot of stuff there, and if you do like the program, please consider that Patreon. The New York Tribune said, Taylor endeared himself to the people. The Nashville Banner says it's a terrible calamity. His patriotism was a guarantee of the whole country would be maintained. The Richmond Whig compared him to the father of his country. He was the man of this time. At New Orleans, bells toll and minute guns fire. At Tammany Hall in New York, Democrats, the opposite party, gather to honor the fallen president. Something we don't think about this moment. There is no direct connection to the nations of Europe. But yet people know which will be the first steamship, the Cambria, leaves from Boston July 10th. It will be the first to bring this news to Europe. It's going to create a sensation, they say.